What's up, everybody? This is the Hedge Mage, and we are back again for another Popper video. Today, we are going to be taking a look at some very recent and some very unique lists that have done fairly well in paper tournaments. And so I've been kind of thinking a lot about just how to kind of showcase how much variety and how unique deck building can be when you're playing in paper versus playing on a platform like MTGO. Obviously, there is the upper echelons of, very competitive tier 1 decks, but even a lot of rogue and tier 2 decks can have really good matchups against tier 1, and so I've been thinking a lot about that and wanting to showcase some of those. So I wanted to kind of start an ongoing series looking at those types of lists because playing in paper is just so much fun and you see so much variety when you do so. So if that sounds interesting to you, definitely stick around as you might enjoy looking at some of these very spicy lists that I have in store for you. As always, guys, if you would like to support the channel, if you could leave a like on this video and hit that subscribe button, I would really appreciate the support. And with that out of the way, let's take a look at the three decks that we will be talking about today. All right, and the first list that we are taking a look at today is Junt Food Deck by Bert of Paradise. And food is definitely an archetype that I've been kind of looking at and trying to see how best to brew it. It doesn't really seem to have the level of support that it truly needs. I mean, Mirkwood Bats has come out, and that s- seems to do a lot, but it's really hard to justify really big spells like that are very easily removed, especially when it only has 3 toughness. So it's but the interesting part about this deck is there's no bats, but it has a lot of food, and I think it did get first place in a paper tournament. I think towards the end of February. So yeah, let's take a look at what Bert of Paradise brought in. So in their creature pile, they brought in 4 Cauldron Familiar, which has a ton of synergy with food, obviously. This was in a lot of the standard food piles back when it first came out. I've been trying to find a good way to play this card since it is obviously Pauper legal. Um, but yeah, did really enjoy playing it in standard when it was legal there. I believe it even got think I remember it getting banned as well, but that was a number of years ago, so I can't quite recall. Uh, and then they brought in 3 copies of Fangren Marauder, which can certainly gain them a lot of life from them, returning Cauldron Familiar and sacrificing foods. Because even if they are tokens, they do technically go to the graveyard for a split second before they just disappear. And they also brought in 4 copies of Generous Ent. This can make food as well as fetch lands for them, so a very good choice. Uh, and 3 copies of Curion Ranger, which they can bounce their gingerbread cabins to play them again and make more food. And I think that is a really important bit with a deck like this, especially when you're running Cauldron Familiar. You need a way to keep making food. Is why cat oven decks have been so strong. Is that it is a way to continually get your Cauldron Familiar in the graveyard and create a food token for you to sacrifice. They also brought in 3 copies of Wood Elves, which also helps get them lands as well as create food with gingerbread cabins. And then in their instant pile, they brought 4 copies of Cast Down. So a pretty efficient removal spell in the format. And then 4 copies of Deadly Dispute. 2 copies of Reckoner's Bargain. And 2 copies of Snuff Out, which them getting a swamp is very easy with both their wood elves and their generous ents. So Snuff Out will probably be a 0 mana spell most of the time for this deck. And then their artifact pile, they got 2 copies of Blood Fountain, 4 copies of Golden Egg, and 4 copies of Lembas. So for the most part, all their artifacts is are just food. I'm surprised they're not running some candy trail. I might consider trying that over the Blood Fountain, though the Blood Fountain does give them artifacts that they can sacrifice as well as being able to get creatures back from the graveyard, like maybe getting their generous Ent back so they can, if late game, just play it and create some more food. So that's probably a pretty good choice as well. Then they brought in 3 copies of makeshift munitions. Obviously, this card is going to be really good for them towards the end of the game, where they can hope maybe just finish off their opponent, or even mid game just deal with their opponent's board state by sacrificing artifacts and just pinging down their little creatures, especially if they're running a lots of 1 toughness things like maybe like fairies or just Koldatha Red, for example. They do tend to have a lot of 1 toughness things with all their goblin tokens. And then in their mana base, it's a 18 land build. They got 6 forests, 4 gingerbread cabins, 2 haunted mires, 2 wooded ridgelines, and 4 woodland chasms. So for the most part, it's just Golgari food, but they are splashing red just for the makeshift munitions. In their sideboard, they brought in 2 copies of Cast into the Fire, 2 copies of Deglamour, which is an amazing removal spell for artifacts and enchantments, just because it deals very well with getting rid of animated lands. Especially if you're going up against, I believe, Jeskai Ephemerate still running the Kenku Artificer. I think there are some All the Glitters builds in blue that are also still running the Artificer, though I've been seeing a lot of people take it out, so the Glamour is starting to feel like maybe less good at times, but it is still very effective. Then they brought in the 3 Diabolic Edicts. So instant so an instant speed edict, which is interesting. I'm a big fan of Chainer's Edict myself just because of the flashback, but being able to cast this at instant speed is not something you should second guess. And then they also brought in 2 copies of Duress for probably control or mid-range games, 2 Fairy Macabras to go up against combo, 2 Nihil's Spell Bombs. Obviously, you got to fight terror somehow, and then 2 copies of Suffocating Fumes, which is really great against Koldatha Red or fairies or anyone with lots of 1 toughness creatures, people running Murmuring Mystic, that sort of thing. But yeah, that is the list. Yeah, very interesting food list. Like I said, very surprised that they don't have a Mirkwood Bats here, but they also aren't running a ton of token generation. They do have a little bit just to create extra food tokens for the Cauldron Familiar, but for the most part, I think they are trying to just kind of whittle you down with the familiar and maybe just end the game with makeshift munitions. Right, and our next list is Mono Blue Deck by Shoji Kawata. So this one is definitely one of the spicier ones. Obviously, the last deck that we looked at, there's kind of have seen some food decks in the metagame a little bit. Though this one was a little interesting just outside of the fact that it was, splashing red for makeshift munitions and, going that route instead of the Mirkwood Bats route, which I have definitely seen that before. But yeah, so let's get into this deck. So basically, it is mono blue fairies, but with a twist. Okay, so what they brought in for their creatures, a lot of stuff you have probably seen before. 4 copies of Fairy Miscreant, 4 Fairy Seers, 2 Mistblade Shinobis, which is something I'm thinking about trying again, especially with all the glitters being around, since it's another way to just bounce their thing that has the enchantment. 4 copies of Moon Circuit Hacker, 2 copies of Ninja of the Deep Hours, 2 Sea Sprites, which tells me that they probably see a lot of mono red wherever they play. 2 copies of Snare Master Sprite, and 4 Spell Stutter Sprites. And then did I bring any sources? Oh yes, of course. Four copies of One Mind, pretty classic for mono blue fairies. And in their instant pile, they got one brainstorm, not four. They got one brainstorm, which is an interesting one of in the deck. Four counterspell, four snap, and three spell pierce. And they also brought in two smoke shroud. Basically, get a bit more damage through with their ninjas. Or great line with this is playing it on a fairy, hitting them for an extra point of damage. Next turn, you ninjutsu the fairy, return smoke shroud to a ninja, and deal more damage. So a lot of fun stuff you can do with smoke shroud. Then in their land base, it's an 18 land build, but this is where things start to get a little strange. They're running three Ash Barons. Yeah, and we'll get to why once we look at the sideboard, because that's when things get really, really interesting, guys. 13 islands and two Obscura storefronts. So in the sideboard, they got three copies of Cast Down. This is where it all starts to make sense. So three Cast Down, four Fairy Macabras, two Nihil Spell Bombs, two Snuff Outs, and four swamps. So basically, after sideboarding, they become a different deck. They become Dimir fairies, or not quite Dimir fairies, but very similar. So they have a lot of options they can bring in with black. Obviously snuff outs, cast down. So then they have some hard removal. Um, and also, Fairy Macabre is really great against combo decks since you can just take away what they're because usually those decks are playing out of the graveyard in some way. Outside of Walls, Walls is a little bit different. They don't play out of the graveyard quite as much as anyone trying to do flicker loops or say like Mogwarts doing stuff with first day of class and persist combos. Um, and then obviously the Nihil Spell Bombs is really great against Tolarian Terror decks. But yeah, basically they become Dimir Fairies after sideboarding, which is maybe a bit of a mind fuck. But yeah, it's pretty wild. So this is definitely probably one of the more unique builds I have seen for Mono Blue Fairies since it actually isn't. But yeah, I this is sort of thing that I wouldn't necessarily recommend playing. This person did do pretty well. I can't remember exactly how they placed, but I think it was within the top four. Um, but yeah, no one's going to see this coming. Everyone's going to be expecting that you're bringing in certain things that usually get brought in with mono blue fairies based on certain matchups. No one's going to really be seeing I cast down and a snuff out enter the field, especially when you then use your ash barons to fetch a swamp. But yeah, pretty cool stuff here. Love love to see just the outright tenacity this player has to just screw with their opponents. And our final deck that we'll be looking at today is a Blue-White Counterspell deck by Magic Sustentival. Probably messed that name up. Uh, that was my best shot. Anywho, this is a pretty fun, interesting list today. Another Tolarian Terror deck. Basically any blue deck and some other color can be good if it's a 1 mana 5/5 with Ward 2. So yeah, we're gonna check out this deck, guys. This one's pretty fun. It's something honestly was kind of thinking about doing myself, and this person did do very well, and they have some interesting card choices as well for the deck. So let's take a look and see what they brought. So in their creature pile, they got two Marine Mystics. It seems like a great card in the main board for this type of deck. Two Palace Sentinels. So they are really trying to be grindy here. This is not as opposed to the Dimir Terror version of this type of deck. They're not trying to get their 1 mana 5/5s out as soon as possible. They're okay being a little bit more reactive and a little more grindy. So yeah, Palace Sentinels, so they can become the monarch and start drawing an extra card each turn. And then 4 copies of Tolarian Terror. In their sorcery piles, just 3 copies of Lord Revealed, which helps fix their mana as well as being a great spell to fill up their hand late game. This card is absolutely amazing. All right, and in their instant pile, they got 1 copy of Catalog, which can, fill up their graveyard with an extra card if they want to pitch instant or sorcery that doesn't really do much for them at the time. Also draws more cards for them. 4 copies of Consider, 4 counterspells, 3 Force Spikes, 2 copies of Hindering Light, 3 Mana Tithes. So essentially, they got 6 Force Spikes, which definitely seems like a lot, though obviously they did do pretty well running 6 of them. So you have to take that into account. And these are the type of spells that a lot of people don't see coming. Um, Especially when people do expect things like Spell Pierce, but things like Force Spike or Mana Tithe aren't necessary when you only have 1 mana up, especially if it's just an untapped planes, they're not going to expect the Mana Tithe. And that's why this card is so beautiful. So yeah, that is love to see the Mana Tithes and the Force Spikes, as they are favorite cards of mine. And they're running 3 ops and 4 peaks. Now this is a pretty interesting include. So they 1 mana to look at their hand and draw a card. So then you can see what they got going on to see whether or not, is this a time where I want to hold up a counterspell? Or do I care? That sort of thing. Also replaces itself, lets you draw a card, puts an instant or sorcery in the graveyard, so you kind of build up your graveyard to be able to cast Tolarian Terror. And 2 copies of Spell Pierce, and 1 copy of Thirst for Meaning. So, this can also, one, it helps them draw cards as well as fill up their graveyard when they need, that 2 extra instants or sorceries to be able to cast their Tolarian Terror for 1 mana. Can really help with that. Also, they can see a much more of their deck. Though I am kind of surprised they're just not running 2 catalogs, as if this is the kind of choice. These are the kind of choices I wouldn't want to have to make, and having to choose and discarding 2 when I'm just really digging. So I'd probably go with 2 catalog over 1 thirst for meaning, but this is a interesting include, as they are running some enchantments in the deck, because they are running 4 copies of Journey to Nowhere, uh, which is a very good removal spell in white, pretty much a staple in the format, and probably one of the best things they can run if they are going blue-white control. All right, and in their mana base, it's an 18 land build, so they got 4 glacial floodplains, 10 islands, and 4 plains. So for the most part, outside of their floodplains, it's all untapped lands. Okay, and in their sideboard, they're bringing in 1 Circle of Protection white, which kind of makes me wonder if they just see a lot of white weenie where they play, or, maybe even Boros Synth and other decks that run white cards. Usually, when I see Circle Protections in sideboards, it's usually Circle Protection blue or Circle Protection red. The white is an interesting one that I haven't actually seen before, so definitely seems like a local meta call here. Well, yeah, interesting to see that. I think if you wanted to run this deck, you could probably, swap out any of Circle Protection based on what you see the most wherever you play, as that can sometimes vary a little bit. And they brought in 3 copies of Dust to Dust, which is a great card to bring in against Affinity. 2 copies of Echoing Truth, great sweeper for Koldatha Red. 4 Hydroblast, which is very useful in Tolarian Terror decks, as you can basically target your own Terror with it just to fill up, or any of your other creatures or other spells, just to fill up your graveyard more if you don't really have a use for it at the time. Especially if it means just dropping a couple Terrors. And then 1 more copy of Palace Sentinels for those grindier matchups. two prismatic strands, which can do a lot for the deck. They don't have a lot of white creatures, but as long as they have a Palace Sentinels out, they'll be able to flash it back. And so you do need to tap a white creature in order to flash it back, though it's also, this card is going to be very helpful in them maintaining the Monarch, which is I think in a lot of games it's going to be very important. I think this deck pretty much wants to have a full hand at all times so that they can have the most interaction possible with whatever their opponent is doing. So basically this deck is trying to tell your opponent, you are not going to play any spells this game unless I allow it. And then they got two copies of Relic of Progenitus, which is interesting that they are running that as a Tolarian Terror deck. Um, this deck can kind of bite you when you're also playing Terra, since it also will exile your graveyard if you choose to exile it or do its second ability. So it can kind of bite you, but it's definitely a really powerful card. Really shuts down a lot of decks that play out of the yard. So it's really good that way. But yeah, that that is a deck. Some very interesting decks this week. And was very excited to take a look at them with all of you guys. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed the video and would very much like to know what you think about the three lists that we looked at today. Uh, is there things that you like or dislike about them? Definitely let me know in the comment section below, and I will see you all next time.